Most RPGs don't begin on a cold December night in midtown Manhattan with steam rising from the sewer grates and folks dressed to the nines heading to an opera at Carnegie Hall. Most RPGs don't center their plot on several TED Talks worth of science surrounding the role of mitochondria in human cells. And most RPGs don't feature shootouts atop a flaming Central Park horse-drawn carriage, a boss fight against a reanimated T-Rex in the Museum of Natural History, and a racist cop spontaneously combusting. And that's because most RPGs aren't Parasite Eve, an oft-forgotten 1998 Squaresoft gem from the PS1 that's filled to the brim with gorgeous art and music, intricate systems, and an excellently spooky vibe that points to a storied developer at their creative apex. It's a prime candidate for a modern-day revisit, so long as you can shuffle through a bit of the jank. You'd be hard-pressed to find a developer over a 4-year period that matches the quality, quantity, breadth, and depth of Square's library from 1997 through the turn of the millennium. A lot of this was thanks to the success of Final Fantasy VII. The PS1 masterpiece was such a monumental critical and commercial hit that it allowed Square to take risks and fund all manner of projects. This period included 3 beloved mainline Final Fantasy games, the birth of new franchises, experimental one-off RPGs, dips into new genres, collections of SNES-era classics, and so much more that helped contribute to their output of over 50 games in that span, not to mention the rarefied love from their fans. Think about the state of modern AAA gaming and how even beloved developers only manage to release a game or two each generation, and that figure is even more impressive. Nestled right in the middle of that run is Parasite Eve, which hit Japan in March of '98 and the US in September of '98, the same month as Mega Man Legends, and right at the start of arguably the best stretch in gaming history. But let's rewind a bit. Parasite Eve began as a 1995 novel written by Hideaki Senna, a graduate pharmacology student who brought that scientific base to his art. It was then adapted into a 1997 film of the same name. I watched the movie for this video, and it was a genuinely well-made melodrama with occasional and effective dips into J-horror. It also does a good job of setting up some of the heady science of the game. I'd tell you to drink every time a character mentions mitochondria, but I fear you would not last long on this mortal coil. But honestly, the movie is worth watching for the score alone, provided by the singularly talented Joe Hisaishi, who's best known for creating the iconic music to Studio Ghibli films including Castle in the Sky, My Neighbor Totoro, Spirited Away, and most recently The Boy and the Heron. The book proved to be a hit from the get-go, so Square got into contact with its publisher about using it as a jumping-off point for a video game sequel that took place in the US instead of Japan. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy, would serve as its producer, which was fitting considering that years earlier, when the team was trying to come up with the concept for what Final Fantasy VII would eventually become, Sakaguchi kept circling back to this idea of a horror-tinged detective story set in New York City. Helming Parasite Eve was Takashi Tokita, coming off directing Live Alive and co-directing Chrono Trigger, but the secret sauce of this experimental team was a composer named Yoko Shimomura. Shimomura began her career at Capcom, contributing music to classics like Street Fighter II, before moving to Square and selling in on some legendary scores like the aforementioned Live Alive, Super Mario RPG, and Legend of Mana, though today her legacy is most closely associated with her work on the Kingdom Hearts franchise. But even in the shadow of those giants, her soundscape for Parasite Eve is astounding, bringing in heavy synths and an 80s urban grime that recalls the scores of John Carpenter.
I mean it.
Development of the game was split between Square's Japan studio as well as their new offices in Hawaii. This would be the first M-rated game in the company's history, adding to the trend of PS1 heavy hitters like Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, and Silent Hill, moving games in a more mature direction. While locking down the final look for its lead character, Detective Aya Brea, Sakaguchi-san enlisted the help of Tetsuya Nomura, a rising star at the studio coming off the high of leading the character designs of Final Fantasy VII. All of this points to an experimental project that was different from anything we'd come to expect from both Square as well as RPGs at the time, which was a key point in the game's Western marketing. I distinctly remember a cover of Electronic Gaming Monthly that featured Aya Brea with an American flag in the background, announcing that Squaresoft was coming to America with more than just Final Fantasy. And yeah, that word America is important because Parasite Eve was inexplicably never released in PAL regions, which means that half the planet just never got a chance to play it at the time. But for those of us who did, the game came bundled with an extra disc showcasing some of Square's upcoming projects. This included a playable demo of Xenogears, a game that feels archive-worthy itself, and movies for Bushido Blade 2, Brave Fencer Musashi, and Final Fantasy VIII. As someone who had season tickets to Square's PS1 lineup, this auxiliary disc felt like a legitimate treasure. Reviews at the time were mixed. The aforementioned Electronic Gaming Monthly scored it in the 7s and 8s. Better than Spice World, but obviously not as good as NFL Blitz 64. But I'm happy to report that booting up the game for a recent replay was an absolute treat. We're immediately greeted by Shimomura's soundtrack over a montage of cinematics from throughout the game, peppered with words like resonance, conception, and liberation. Right from the start, again, it is clear we're playing something different. In Parasite Eve, the traditional dungeons are landmarks like Soho, Central Park, and the Chrysler Building. Its dragons are grotesque mutations of sewer rats, police dogs, and zoo animals, many of which are introduced with exquisite CG cutscenes that would feel right at home in a Cronenberg film. Instead of focusing its story on ancient prophecies and questionable religions, Parasite Eve roots its struggle in the almighty mitochondria. Does the game's science check out? I don't know. I'm not a biologist. I'm a professional internet goof. But the game takes its science serious enough to make me care about the stakes, worry when my pals are in peril, and effectively drive the action forward, so that's honestly all that really matters to me. The gameplay kicks off with a bang. The inciting incident at the Opera House where Eve sets the audience ablaze left a lasting impression on 12-year-old me and is still super effective today. Also, this moment where Aya shoulder checks her dumb date not only out of frame but out of the entire story itself does an amazing job of characterization and making us go all in for our hero right off the bat. I've spoken in the past about how much I adore the pre-rendered backgrounds of this era, and Parasite Eve has them up the wazoo. From the eerie emptiness of the backstage opera house to the lived-in clutter of the police station, there is a wonderful depth to each frame here, and it goes a long way towards making a relatively small game that only clocks in at 8 hours or so feel like the sprawling metropolis of its actual setting. That police station where Aya works provides a cozy respite between your horrific outings, with charming coworkers, a certified Shimomura banger, and the meat and potatoes of the weapon upgrade system. You pick a gun to dismantle, choose stats and abilities you want to carry over, and glom it onto your next gun. This is repeated throughout the entirety of your playthrough, and even into New Game Plus, leaving your guns and armor feeling like a cross between the ship of Theseus and a sourdough starter. Battles unfold in the same spaces you're exploring, similar to Chrono Trigger, though you can't spot foes beforehand. The screen pulsates for a second, rad music kicks in, and the monsters materialize in front of you. There's a great sense of energy to the combat, as both yourself and the beasties are free to move around while your action bar fills up. Learning enemy patterns and knowing where to position yourself to avoid attacks while being in an opportune place for your own meant that I never turned my brain off during an encounter. This goes double for the boss fights that pop up at a nice consistent pace and have a sort of puzzle nature to them as you figure out the best course of action. Though, full disclosure, the final boss fight is a genuine pain in the ass, and I will not judge you for rage quitting at some point during its 4 stages and just watching the ending on YouTube. There's also a New Game Plus mode with its own 77-floor mega dungeon in the Chrysler Building, complete with a true final boss and ending, which I most certainly did not partake in because all of that sounds exhausting. And also I only have room in my life for one PS1 era RPG skyscraper that I have to climb all the way up, and Final Fantasy VII Shinra Building already asked me to that dance. If you do decide to revisit Parasite Eve today, just know that there are some clunky design choices that try their hardest to get in your way. Aya's painfully slow run speed makes backtracking across areas feel like a Herculean task, and couple this with some cumbersome item and equipment menus, and it's easy to get bogged down in the minutia. But I have a pretty strong stomach for jank, and it's well worth chewing on some of these tougher pieces to get to the excellent meat of the thing. And also, this isn't something that the game does badly, but rather something I wish the game did at all. I would have loved to have more of Aya's random thoughts and observations as you interact with various pieces around the environment. Like, here's a newly crisped body. How do we feel about that? I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm fresh off a replay of Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, which does this in spades, but having a character provide quick-hit thoughts on the people, places, objects, and events surrounding them does a great job of fleshing out the world in an economical way. My replay made it clear why Square saw the potential in Parasite Eve as a franchise, though the way they handled that evolution was less than stellar. We saw a quick turnaround of the PS1 sequel in 1999 with Parasite Eve 2, and then a decade later, Aya returned on the PSP with The Third Birthday, a sequel that felt like such a departure that it didn't even include the words Parasite Eve in its title. You'd be hard-pressed to find a trilogy of games that feel as mechanically different as these. Instead of a logical evolution from entry to entry, it feels like the baby's tossed out with the bathwater every time, as the games move from a tightly paced horror RPG to a more sprawling action RPG to a big ol' mess of a third-person shooter.
If enemies are giving you trouble, go ahead and use Crossfire.
The Third Birthday delivers its action in bite-sized chunks, similar to how Peace Walker or Crisis Core adapted their franchises to a handheld platform.
I can do it.
But the story is a mess, the horror is non-existent, and it feels like it abandoned its core fanbase for an action audience that never showed up. That said, Parasite Eve 2 has some merit to it. It trades in the sprawl of New York City in favor of a handful of different settings, including a ghost town in the American Southwest with some excellently dusty vibes. It leans heavier into the resi of it all, with full tank controls, more humanoid enemies, and even being directed by the writer of the original Resident Evil. And hot damn, just look at this rad tracking shot. And yeah, that's where Parasite Eve exists today, a loose trilogy that hasn't been revisited by Square for a decade and a half, save for Aya making an appearance as a guest character in the Final Fantasy Brave Exvius gacha game, which most certainly does not count. Like Mega Man Legends, the Parasite Eve games are still only available legally via original PS1 disc or digitally on PS3 or Vita. But as usual, indies are carrying the torch, particularly with the recently revealed 45 Parabellum Bloodhound, which looks crunchy and delightful. With that said, I'm not too proud to admit that every time a Nintendo Direct or a Keighley Bonanza rolls around, I stand up in front of my mirror, carefully apply my clown makeup, and wait to be disappointed when there's no announcement of Parasite Eve or Square's other more experimental PS1 bangers like Xenogears, Brave Fencer Musashi, or Vagrant Story making a return. But in a world where Live Alive and Chrono Cross can rise from the ashes, I'll never let that radical dream fade away.
Together, we're unstoppable!
And at the end of the day, one of the reasons I love Parasite Eve so much is that we just don't have enough spooky JRPGs, so I cherish the ones that we do have. Whether that's specific moments like Threed in Earthbound, coming across the Emerald Weapon in Final Fantasy VII, or encountering the Reaper for the first time in any modern Persona games. Or full-on horror RPGs like Kudelka, Shadow Hearts, or the kid-friendly Halloween vibes of Double Fine's Costume Quest. Or, hell, just watching Super Eyepatch Wolf slowly lose his sanity through Fear and Hunger Games. I like that one.
Anything but that! Anything but him!
Parasite Eve sits alongside these as an RPG that feels right at home during an October filled with horror games. So this year, as the leaves start to change, a chill enters the air, and the pumpkin spice must flow, look towards a PS1 RPG to get you in that holiday spirit. One where your knights are humble detectives, where castles are the Manhattan skyline, and where dragons are replaced by racist cops getting absolutely obliterated.
Hey, Javad the editor here. Once again, Marty has done an incredible job at teaching me something I knew nothing about. Little does he know he's kind of kickstarting a little bit of an interest in the JRPG scene, which is something I've never had before. I picked up Final Fantasy VII just the other day and playing that through for the first time. I think the first Final Fantasy game I ever played was Final Fantasy IX. A friend had lent it to me, but I only had the first 2 discs out of 4, I believe. And so I got halfway in, I loved it, but then I just never finished the story because I never got the other 2 discs. So yeah, I think this is, I'm excited for my little Final Fantasy journey, but yeah, this episode was a real joy to cut together, learning about something that I knew nothing about. Marty he's a clever chicken.